Marian settled into the armchair by her small, decorated Christmas tree, the warmth of its colored lights contrasting with the chill creeping through her house. The day was quiet, almost too quiet, as she reflected on all the Christmases she'd shared here, each one filling this very room with joy and laughter. But this year, the silence seemed louder, as if it too had a voice, a reminder of everything that had changed. She glanced around at the knickknacks and memories scattered throughout the room. The framed photograph of her and Richard, her late husband, smiling brightly under the mistletoe, the worn songbooks they'd both annotated over the years, and her piano, now closed and silent, the holiday tunes it once knew by heart long since played. Marian reached out and gently touched the keys, running her fingers over the smooth surface as though Richard might still be there, his fingers guiding hers in duet. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her reverie. Her daughter, Sarah, stepped inside, carrying a bundle of holiday decorations and, as always, a cheerful energy that Marian couldn't quite muster. "Merry Christmas, Mom." Sarah's voice was bright, a note of hope woven into it. Marian managed a small smile. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart. I wasn't expecting you so early." "Well, I thought I'd come by and bring a little Christmas cheer," Sarah said, placing the decorations on the table. She paused, studying her mother. "Mom, there's something I want to talk to you about." Marian knew the look on Sarah's face, the one that suggested a conversation was coming that she might not want to hear. Sarah took a deep breath. "I was thinking you might want to come to the community center's Christmas event this year. They're hosting something special, a bit of a tribute." Marian's heart tightened, her gaze shifting to the photograph of her and Richard. She hadn't attended the community's holiday gathering since he'd passed. It was too painful to be there without him, especially when they'd both given so much to the town's holiday celebrations. "It'll be a nice chance for you to reconnect," Sarah continued, her voice softening. "The whole town remembers you, Mom. They still talk about the carols you and Dad would sing." "I'm not sure I'm up for it," Marian murmured, pulling her cardigan a little tighter around herself. "It's hard to go there without him." "Just think about it," Sarah said, giving her mother's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You might find more waiting for you than you expect." The idea lingered, refusing to leave Marian's mind even as Sarah prepared to leave. And as the silence crept back, Marian found herself glancing at the songbook on the piano, wondering, perhaps for the first time, if there was something left there for her after all. The community center glowed warmly under the evening sky as Marian and Sarah approached. The festive lights twinkled like stars against the backdrop of snow, and soft music drifted out from the building, a familiar melody mingling with laughter and chatter from inside. Despite herself, Marian felt her heart tug at the sound. So many years of her life had been spent here, teaching music and celebrating the holidays with Richard. Sarah squeezed her hand, guiding her through the doors. "I think you'll be surprised by what they've prepared." Stepping inside, Marian was greeted by a cascade of holiday decorations. Wreaths, twinkling lights, and garlands filled the space, each detail carefully placed. Familiar faces smiled at her as she passed, and a soft murmur of whispers followed, a mixture of welcome and nostalgia that wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. "Oh, Mrs. Connors," a former student called out, her eyes alight with excitement. "It's so good to see you here again." Marian managed a gentle nod, still feeling the weight of her reluctance, though it softened with each greeting. Sarah's gentle encouragement, too, was a steadying presence by her side, a reminder that she wasn't alone. The center of the room held a small stage, and on it, a choir of young singers prepared to perform. Their choir director, a young man Marian recognized but couldn't quite place, smiled as he saw her enter. There was an undeniable energy in his eyes, as if he held a secret that would soon be revealed. "Mom, this is Ben," Sarah whispered as they approached the stage. "He's the new choir director, and a big fan of yours and Dad's carols." "Mrs. Connors," Ben said warmly, shaking her hand. "It's an honor to have you here. We have a special performance tonight, a tribute to the Christmas carol you and Mr. Connors composed. It's inspired so many people, including me." Marian's heart skipped a beat as she registered his words. The carol they'd written, a melody born from late-night practice sessions and Richard's impromptu lyrics, was about to be performed again. She hadn't heard it sung in years, and the thought of it filled her with a bittersweet ache. As the choir began to sing, Marian felt the years slip away, memories filling her mind. Richard's voice echoed in her thoughts, blending with the voices of the young choir. Each note brought a wave of nostalgia, and Marian found herself lost between the present and the past, reliving the love and joy that song had always brought her. When the final note faded, the applause that erupted shook her back into the present. She felt a quiet warmth rise within her, a warmth she hadn't felt in years, as if her heart had awakened. Ben approached her again, his expression one of admiration. "Your song means so much to this community, Mrs. Connors. Thank you for sharing it with us." Marian felt the strength of his words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe them. Perhaps, just perhaps, the legacy she and Richard had built was still alive and well, held dearly in the hearts of the people here. After the choir's performance, Marian sat quietly, absorbing the heartfelt tribute. She hadn't anticipated the pull of memories that would come rushing back. The feeling of singing alongside Richard, the joy they'd shared in creating music together. Each face she passed held a reminder, each one reflecting a piece of her past that she thought had faded away. People from the crowd began to approach her, one by one, sharing memories and stories. A couple in their 30s recalled how she'd taught them the carol's harmonies as children, and how they had sung it every year since. An elderly man recounted a Christmas decades ago when Marian and Richard had surprised the town by performing the carol in the middle of a snowstorm. Each story stirred an image from her life, a vivid reminder of a time she had nearly forgotten. "Mrs. Connors, I don't know if you remember me," a young woman said, her voice wavering with emotion. "You taught me to play the piano when I was in high school. I think of you and your husband every time I play that carol for my children now." Marian's heart swelled with gratitude. She hadn't realized the depth of her influence or how her life's work had carried on quietly, like an underground current. As the evening wore on, Marian found herself sinking further into these memories, transported back to a time when she and Richard filled the town with music and laughter. Her reluctance to attend this gathering faded, replaced by a growing appreciation for what her life and music had given to others. Looking at Sarah, Marian noticed her daughter's quiet smile. She understood now why Sarah had brought her here, not just to remember Richard, but to show her the legacy they'd built together. Marian felt a flicker of peace she hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging that warmed her heart. As people began to filter out of the hall, Ben, the choir director, approached her. "Thank you for coming tonight, Mrs. Connors," he said, his eyes bright. "We owe a lot to you and Mr. Connors. That carol has a life of its own here." Marian nodded, feeling that strange, bittersweet ache again. The life she and Richard had shared wasn't gone. It was alive in these people, in the songs they still sang and the memories they still held dear. And tonight, surrounded by echoes of the past, she allowed herself to believe that. The evening had wrapped up, and only a few people remained at the community center, helping to tidy up and gather belongings. Ben lingered nearby, chatting warmly with a few choir members. Marian observed him quietly, noticing how his enthusiasm for the music mirrored her own in her youth. "Would you like to take a closer look at the sheet music?" he asked her, catching her eye. A slight hesitation flitted through her. She hadn't touched the carol's sheet music in years, but something in Ben's expression, a mixture of awe and respect, nudged her forward, and she found herself stepping onto the stage. Ben handed her the well-worn sheet music, and as Marian held it, the notes seemed to float off the page, triggering a cascade of memories. She remembered Richard scribbling down lyrics late at night, the way he'd hum out new melodies in their living room, and the countless hours they'd spent perfecting each line together. The warmth of those memories enveloped her, and her fingers tingled with an impulse she hadn't felt in years. "It's beautiful," Ben said quietly, sensing her reverence. Marian's voice softened. "Richard and I, we poured everything we had into this carol. Every note, every word. It was our way of capturing the magic we felt each Christmas. A silence hung between them, both heavy and comforting. Ben's respect for the carol was evident, and Marian could feel a rekindling of her own love for the music they had created. Would you be willing to play it?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. For a moment, she hesitated. Her hands trembled as they hovered over the piano keys, memories both joyful and painful blending together. But as she pressed the first note, the hesitation melted away, and she was transported back in time, each note filling the empty room and surrounding her with a familiar warmth. The melody poured out, as sweet and alive as it had been when she'd played it with Richard by her side. The years faded with each note, and it was as if he was there with her, his voice blending with hers, guiding her hands. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she didn't stop, allowing the song to flow uninterrupted. Ben listened with rapt attention, his face a mixture of admiration and awe. When the final note hung in the air, he clapped softly, reverently. "Mrs. Connors, that was incredible. I can see now why this carol means so much to everyone." Marian closed her eyes, catching her breath as the last remnants of the song lingered in her mind. For the first time in years, she felt something she thought she'd lost, a sense of peace and fulfillment, knowing that the music she and Richard had created was still here, still alive. Ben smiled, his eyes glistening. "You know, we could really use someone like you to help guide our choir. Maybe you'd consider coming back to work with us next Christmas." Marian looked at him, surprised by the invitation. She hadn't thought she had anything left to give, but as she gazed at the young choir director, a flicker of hope sparked within her. "I'll think about it, Ben," she said, her voice soft but steady. For the first time in years, Marian felt the beginnings of a new chapter, her heart lifted by the possibility of rekindling her love for music. The next morning, Marian sat in her kitchen, stirring her tea absently. She replayed the previous night over and over, feeling the lingering warmth of the music, but also grappling with a new sense of hesitation. Had she been right to play the carol again? Memories of Richard had come flooding back, leaving her caught between nostalgia and an ache she hadn't anticipated. Sarah entered the kitchen with a gentle smile, her eyes searching Marian's face. "You seemed different last night, Mom. Happy." Marian managed a small smile in return, but her heart felt heavy. "I don't know, Sarah. It's been so long since I played that song, and it brought back everything I've tried to keep buried." Sarah nodded, understanding. "But maybe it's time to let those memories breathe again. You and Dad put so much of yourselves into that carol. People haven't forgotten. Ben hasn't forgotten." The mention of Ben caused Marian's heart to flutter, both from his invitation and her reluctance. "He asked if I'd help with the choir next Christmas," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes brightened. "That's wonderful. You should say yes." Marian shook her head, looking away. "I'm not so sure. It's hard to imagine doing it alone without your father. Every note, every melody reminds me of him. But, Mom, that's why you should do it. Don't you see? This is a way to keep his memory alive, to share what you both loved with others." Sarah's hand covered Marian's, warm and steady. "You don't have to let go of him. You just have to let him be a part of this new chapter." Marian's heart softened at her daughter's words, but the doubts lingered. Could she really step back into the world she and Richard had built together without him by her side? She felt as if she was standing on the edge of a chasm, uncertain of what lay beyond. As Sarah left for the day, Marian wandered to the piano, running her fingers over the keys without pressing down. The melody of their carol echoed in her mind, haunting yet beautiful, like a ghost of a life she once knew. She closed her eyes, as if waiting for a sign that Richard would want her to continue. But the silence that filled the room was her only answer, leaving her caught between her memories and the life that lay ahead. A few days later, Marian returned to the community center, intending to thank Ben and the choir for the tribute they'd paid her and Richard. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by familiar faces, each one lighting up at the sight of her. The warmth of their smiles tugged at her heart, and she realized how much she'd missed this sense of connection. Mrs. Connors called out a woman named Linda, a longtime friend and fellow teacher. "You were wonderful the other night. Hearing you play that carol again was like stepping back in time. Others gathered around, sharing their memories. Marian listened as people recounted stories from Christmases past, how she and Richard's performances had become a staple of their own holiday traditions. Each tale was a thread that wove together her life and theirs, a fabric of shared history she hadn't realized was so tightly knit. "Do you remember the year it snowed so much that the whole town was nearly snowed in?" Another voice chimed in. Marian turned to see Mr. Thompson, a spry older man with a mischievous grin. "Oh, I remember," Marian said, laughing. Richard insisted on singing the carol on the steps of the center, snowstorm or not. The group laughed, voices filling the air like the melody of her and Richard's song. These were her people, friends, neighbors, former students, each one carrying a piece of her and Richard's life with them. Their stories and laughter lifted a weight from her heart, reminding her of the joy she'd once felt and could feel again. Finally, she turned to Ben, who had been waiting quietly nearby. He greeted her with a warm smile, nodding to the crowd. "See, your music has lived on in ways you may not have imagined." Marian met his gaze, feeling both humbled and moved. "I hadn't realized how much of our lives were tied to this place," she admitted. Ben nodded thoughtfully. "It's all here, waiting for you to bring it back. We'd love to have you with us." The invitation was clear, and though her doubts lingered, they were beginning to loosen, like knots slowly coming undone. Marian glanced around at the faces that filled the room, each one a reminder of the life she and Richard had built here. It wasn't just a memory. It was alive, woven into the people and the music they'd all shared. Taking a deep breath, Marian felt a spark of courage. Perhaps it was time to reclaim the joy she'd once known, to rekindle the light of the music she and Richard had created together. A week later, Marian found herself back at the community center, this time seated in the front row for a choir rehearsal. Ben had invited her to watch their practice, and though she still felt a twinge of reluctance, curiosity and a growing sense of purpose had brought her here. The choir was a mix of young and old voices, all unified under Ben's guidance. He moved between them, his energy infectious, his enthusiasm lighting up the room. Watching him, Marian felt a pang of nostalgia. Ben's love for music reminded her so much of herself and Richard in their early years. She found herself smiling as she watched him bring out the best in each singer, his encouragement and joy giving life to the music. During a break, Ben approached her, a shy smile playing on his face. "Mrs. Connors, I'm so glad you came today." Marian nodded, feeling her usual reserve soften in his presence. "I can see why you're leading this choir. You have a way of connecting with people." He smiled, clearly touched. "I learned a lot from watching you and Mr. Connors over the years. Your carol is what inspired me to pursue music, actually. I wanted to be part of something that brought people together like that." Marian's eyes glistened as she listened. She hadn't realized how deeply their music had touched others, let alone influenced someone like Ben to continue their legacy. It felt like a bridge between the past and present, spanning across years and lives. "Would you consider working with us on our Christmas program next year?" he asked gently. "It would mean so much to everyone, and I know the choir would love to have your guidance." The offer hung in the air, and Marian felt a flutter of hesitation. But as she looked around at the choir, these people who cherished her music as deeply as she did, a sense of purpose began to grow in her heart. "I think I'd like that," she said quietly, feeling the warmth of her words settle within her. "I'd like to work with the choir." Ben's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Connors. You're going to bring something really special to this program." As the choir resumed practice, Marian sat back, listening as they sang her carol. The voices rose and blended in perfect harmony, each note stirring memories and emotions within her. For the first time in years, she felt as if she were truly part of something again, as if her life's work had found new roots to grow in. Marian left the rehearsal that day with a lighter heart, a feeling of renewal blossoming within her. The next rehearsal brought Marian to the community center once again, this time with a renewed sense of commitment. She was greeted warmly by the choir members, many of whom expressed their excitement at her involvement. Marion felt a blend of anticipation and nervousness. It had been so long since she'd led a group in song. Ben introduced her formally to the choir, his admiration evident. Mrs. Connors is here to help us bring her and her late husband's carol to life in a way we've never done before. I can't think of anyone more fitting to guide us. A ripple of appreciation ran through the group, and Marion felt her heart swell with pride and gratitude. Taking her place beside the piano, she took a deep breath, allowing the memories of Richard and their shared love for music to strengthen her resolve. Before we start, Marion began, I want to share what this carol meant to me and Richard. It was more than just a melody to us. It was a promise. Each Christmas, we'd sing it to remind ourselves of the love and hope that bound us together. I'm honored to share it with all of you. She looked around, seeing her words resonate with the choir members. Each face seemed to hold a deep reverence for the song and its meaning, and Marion felt her nerves give way to a sense of unity. As they started to rehearse, Marion guided them through each verse, infusing it with emotion she and Richard had once poured into it. At first, it was difficult. Her voice trembled, and her hands shook slightly as she played. But with each repetition, she grew more confident, feeling the weight of the past transform into something vibrant and alive. The choir responded with matching enthusiasm, their voices filling the room with the carol's familiar melody. Marion felt her heart race as they sang the opening lines, the notes echoing like a long-lost memory brought to life. Each verse seemed to carry a piece of her history, and she felt herself being pulled into the music as if she were singing alongside Richard once again. When they reached the final line, the room fell into silence, the lingering notes hanging in the air like a whispered memory. Marion's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of fulfillment. For the first time in years, she felt whole. Ben clapped softly, his admiration clear. Mrs. Connors, that was incredible. You brought something so powerful to the music. The choir members nodded in agreement, their faces filled with emotion. Marion felt a wave of gratitude wash over her as she looked at them, realizing that their voices had breathed new life into her and Richard's carol. Leaving the community center that day, Marion felt an undeniable sense of peace. She'd spent years keeping her memories of Richard close, fearful of letting go, but sharing the music they'd created together had opened her heart in ways she hadn't thought possible. The days leading up to Christmas were filled with rehearsal, and Marion grew more comfortable with each session, finding herself at ease among the choir members. Each rehearsal brought them closer together, creating a bond that reminded her of her early days singing alongside Richard. Their shared passion for the carol seemed to bridge the distance between her past and the present. One evening, after a particularly moving rehearsal, Ben suggested they all take a break to share stories about Christmases past. The choir gathered in a circle, laughing and reminiscing about holiday memories, and Marion found herself wrapped in the warmth of their camaraderie. Mrs. Connors, what's your favorite Christmas memory? One of the younger choir members asked, her eyes filled with curiosity. Marion paused, taken aback by the question. Memories of countless Christmases with Richard floated to the surface, each one precious in its own way. But one memory stood out above the rest. It was a snowy Christmas Eve many years ago. She began, her voice soft and steady. Richard and I were performing this very carol on the steps of the community center. The snow was falling so heavily that we could barely see each other, but we kept singing. The whole town gathered around us, everyone huddled close to stay warm. I remember looking at Richard and feeling like we were sharing something timeless, something that went beyond just the two of us. The room fell silent as she spoke, her words weaving a picture of the past that everyone could almost see. She could feel the love and respect from the choir, their quiet understanding filling the room. Ben, sitting beside her, gave her a gentle smile. That's exactly what we're creating here, Mrs. Connors, a timeless connection. It's a beautiful gift you've given us. Touched, Marion nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. For the first time since losing Richard, she felt that the legacy they'd built together would live on, cherished and remembered. The carol wasn't just hers or Richard's. It belonged to everyone who'd sung it, to the community that had embraced it year after year. The evening continued, with laughter and stories blending with the warmth of friendship. Marian returned home that night with a lightness in her heart, knowing that she was no longer carrying her memories alone. On Christmas Eve, Marian sat in her living room, the faint sound of carolers singing outside her window. Her home was quiet, the only light coming from the small Christmas tree in the corner, casting a warm glow over the room. She'd spent so many Christmas Eves here with Richard, their home filled with laughter and music. Tonight, though she was surrounded by memories, she felt a peace that she hadn't known in years. The events of the past few weeks replayed in her mind: Ben's invitation, the rehearsals, the stories shared. She felt a gentle ache for Richard, but it was different this time. It was softened by gratitude, by the knowledge that their love and music had left a lasting impact. Marian's gaze drifted to the framed photo of her and Richard on the mantel. She reached for it, her fingers brushing over the glass as if she could still feel his presence beside her. "I wish you could be here to see this," she whispered. "They're still singing our song, Richard. They haven't forgotten." A soft knock on the door broke the silence, and Marian quickly set the photo down, wiping away a stray tear. She opened the door to find Sarah standing there, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "Merry Christmas, Mom," Sarah said, stepping inside and wrapping her arms around her mother. "I thought I'd spend the evening with you." Marian's heart swelled with warmth. She'd expected to be alone tonight, but Sarah's presence was a reminder of the family she still had, of the love that endured even through loss. They settled in the living room, Sarah bringing a few small gifts and treats to share. They laughed and talked, and as the hours passed, Marian felt the quiet ache in her heart lessen. She found herself sharing stories of past Christmases, stories that had been too painful to revisit until now. As midnight approached, Sarah took her mother's hand, her expression soft and full of understanding. "Mom, I want you to know that everything you and Dad created together is still alive. It's in the music, in the community, in me. You're not alone." Marian felt tears rise again, but they were tears of gratitude, of quiet acceptance. She realized that Richard's absence didn't mean his presence was gone. He lived on in every note of their carol, in every heart that remembered their love. That night, as she watched the Christmas tree lights twinkle, Marian felt a peace settle over her. She was ready to let go, not of the memories, but of the sorrow she'd carried with them. She knew that in every Christmas to come, she would hear their carol echo through the town, a reminder that love, once shared, never truly fades. Christmas Day dawned crisp and bright, and Marian awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. She'd spent the morning in quiet reflection, reliving the memories she'd shared with Richard and treasuring the fresh ones she'd made with the choir and community. It was as though the weight of the past had lifted, leaving only warmth and gratitude in its place. Later that afternoon, Sarah arrived with Ben and a few choir members, their faces bright with holiday cheer. They carried gifts and a beautiful, handcrafted frame that held the sheet music of her and Richard's carol. Marian's eyes filled with tears as she read the dedication beneath the notes, "To Marian and Richard Connors, whose love and music will forever echo in our hearts." "Mom, we wanted you to have this," Sarah said, her voice full of love and pride. "It's a small way to say thank you for everything you and Dad have given us." Marian reached out to touch the frame, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingers as if she were holding a piece of her past. She took a deep breath, steadying her voice. "Thank you all. This means so much to me. Richard and I never imagined that our little song would mean so much to so many people." Ben smiled, his eyes bright with admiration. "Mrs. Connors, your carol is part of all our lives now. We're honored to keep it alive with you." Marian looked around the room, seeing the faces of those who had come to share this moment with her. Each one held a part of her and Richard's legacy, and the gratitude she felt was overwhelming. She realized now that their love, their music, had not only shaped her life, but had woven its way into the hearts of everyone here. Together, they sang the carol once more, voices mingling in harmony, filling the room with the familiar melody. Marion's heart swelled with pride and peace. This was more than a song. It was a living tribute to the life and love she'd shared with Richard, a reminder of all they'd created together. As the final notes faded, Marion knew she was no longer carrying her memories alone. They had been given back to her, alive in the voices and hearts of those who remembered. And with that, she felt truly at home. With the new year approaching, Marion found herself looking forward in a way she hadn't done in years. She'd accepted Ben's invitation to work with the choir on future performances, and the idea brought a spark of excitement she hadn't felt since Richard had been by her side. She knew she could keep his memory alive by continuing their shared passion, letting the music they loved be her guide. On a snowy afternoon, Marion met Ben at the community center to discuss their plans for the coming year. The center was quiet, the holiday decorations still hanging, creating an atmosphere of warmth and anticipation. "I've been thinking about our program for next Christmas," Ben began, laying out a few sheets of music on the table. "We could make it a celebration of traditional carols, along with your and Mr. Connor's piece as the centerpiece." Marion nodded, smiling. "I think Richard would love that. He was always such a fan of traditional carols, the ones that really bring people together." Ben's face lit up. "Then it's settled. You'll be my co-director for the choir next year." Marion laughed softly, feeling a wave of confidence wash over her. "I'd be honored, Ben." As they discussed the details, Marion's mind wandered to Richard, knowing he'd be proud of her decision to keep the music alive. For so long, she'd held back, thinking that her love and passion for music were bound to him alone. But now, she saw that the music they'd shared could carry her forward, helping her forge new bonds and breathe new life into their shared legacy. The months passed, and Marion became a regular presence at the choir rehearsals, guiding the singers with gentle patience and sharing stories of her time performing with Richard. She watched as the choir members grew in confidence, their voices blending beautifully with each new rehearsal. And as they sang, Marion felt as if a piece of Richard was there with her, smiling through every note and every harmony. When spring arrived, the community center held a small concert with Marion and Ben directing the choir. The event was a success, with families and friends gathered to enjoy the music, their faces alight with joy and appreciation. Marion's heart swelled with pride as she watched the choir perform, knowing that Richard's spirit was present in every voice, every smile, every heart. As the final song ended and the applause rang out, Marion looked out at the crowd, feeling a deep, abiding peace. She had found a new beginning in the love and music that she and Richard had created together, and she knew that, even though he was gone, he would always be a part of her life. She had rediscovered her purpose, her passion, and her place within the community, and she felt certain that her journey with music was far from over. As the year drew to a close, Marion found herself wrapped in excitement and preparations for Christmas. The choir was rehearsing in full swing, and with each practice, she felt Richard's presence more vividly. The carol they had composed together seemed to echo through her every day, a reminder of the love they'd shared and the legacy she was building anew. On Christmas Eve, Marion spent the morning with Sarah, exchanging gifts and laughter in the cozy warmth of her daughter's home. They reminisced over past holidays, and Marion shared stories about Richard and their early days, her voice filled with warmth and nostalgia. It was the first time in years that she spoke of him without hesitation, feeling that her heart had finally found a balance between memory and presence. That evening, Marion returned to the community center for the choir's performance. She took her place in the front row, watching as Ben gathered choir members and gave them a final, encouraging nod. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience as the first notes of their carol filled the room. The music was soft at first, the gentle melody weaving its way through the crowd like a familiar embrace. Marion closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, each note carrying her back to the Christmases she'd spent with Richard. She felt tears prick her eyes, but didn't shy away from them. They were tears of joy and gratitude, a release of all the love she still held for him. As the carol reached its crescendo, the choir's voices grew, strong and harmonious, filling the room with warmth and light. Marian felt as if the entire town was singing alongside them, each voice a testament to the enduring spirit of Christmas and the love that had blossomed in their small community. When the last note faded, the audience burst into applause, their cheers filling the space. Ben turned to Marian, his eyes shining with pride and gratitude, and motioned for her to join the choir on stage. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, but as the crowd chanted her name, she rose, her steps steady and sure. Standing beside the choir, Marian felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. She took a deep breath, letting the applause wash over her, feeling the love and support of everyone around her. She smiled, her heart full, knowing that she'd come full circle, honoring both Richard's memory and her own journey. That night, surrounded by her community, Marian felt as though she had found her place again, not only in the music, but in the hearts of those she had touched. With the new year just beginning, Marian sat by her window one snowy morning, gazing out at the town blanketed in white. The memories of the Christmas concert were fresh in her mind, and as she sipped her tea, she felt a deep contentment settle within her. She knew, without a doubt, that Richard would be proud of all she'd done. The framed sheet music of their carol hung above her piano now, a reminder of the love they had shared and the life they had built together. It was more than a piece of music. It was a symbol of the lasting impact they had on their community, a carol that had brought people together year after year and had, in many ways, shaped Marian's journey back to herself. A knock on the door broke her from her thoughts, and she opened it to find Ben, bundled up against the winter chill. "Good morning, Mrs. Connors," he greeted her, his face bright with excitement. "I have something I wanted to discuss with you." Marian welcomed him inside, curiosity sparkling in her eyes. "What brings you here so early, Ben?" Ben cleared his throat, a slight nervousness in his voice. "I've been thinking about expanding our Christmas program for next year. I thought it might be nice to add some of the older carols, ones that carry a story, like yours and Mr. Connor's song." Marian smiled, warmth filling her chest. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Ben. I'd be honored to help with that." Ben's face lit up, and they began discussing plans, the excitement of a new tradition taking shape. Together, they envisioned a holiday program that would bring people from surrounding towns, creating a lasting tradition in the community. And Marian knew that this, too, was part of her legacy, something that would live on, not just in the carol she'd composed with Richard, but in the music they would continue to share. As Ben left, Marian returned to her piano, sitting down to play their carol one last time before putting it aside for the season. The familiar notes filled the room, soft and pure, carrying with them all the love, joy, and memories she held dear. She knew that, though Richard was gone, his spirit was woven into the music, into the lives they touched, and into the town that had embraced them both. In that quiet moment, Marian understood that some songs never truly end. They echo through time, carried by those who remember, a melody that lingers in the heart. And as she played the final note, she felt Richard's presence beside her, a gentle reminder that their love would live on, a carol that would never fade. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a like and let us know in the comments. What part of the story impacted you the most? Was it Marian's journey of rediscovery, the community's heartwarming tribute, or the timeless connection of music and memory? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, if you have ideas for future stories or themes you'd like to see, drop them in the comments below. Your feedback and suggestions are what make this channel special, and we're excited to bring more stories to life with your input. Thank you for being part of our community.